I have many intellectual, different kinds of questions. The first thing I want to ask you, how is, if you were able to show the film in Mexico, or in some of the areas where you filmed in, with especially the folks in the movie, what was their response when they saw the finished film?
So when this film premiered during the pandemic in 2020 actually, but 2021 was a special year. That was the actual 500-year countdown. And that summer, we screened the film in a roadshow way, you know, like taking like a projector and a screen and a van and driving around. And we visited all the characters. And we also offered them an opportunity to curate a screening. So like, hey, like what government agency or nonprofit do you want there? Like, let's do a panel with you and other people and we could talk about whatever. And you know, for the first person, the son of the journalist, he wanted to do it in a bookstore in his city. And you know, him and one of the collaborators on the film just talked about the murder of journalists for like an hour in a panel ahead of the film. And we got press coverage for them, and we just went all the way to Mexico City with these screenings, just pop-up screenings in plazas and schools, and it was awesome. And that was part of the commitment I had made to them. I'm going to come back and I'm going to screen the film here with you, so that you can experience this, because you know we clearly didn't have the resources to take everyone to a big film festival, and then COVID happened. But they wanted to show it to their community because these stories have been told many times. Like you'll find some of these folks in the paper, especially the last character, Lorena. She's kind of famous now. But very seldomly have they been approached through this lens of respect and art, you know? And so I wanted to bring it back. And it was great. They loved it. We had a great time.
Question? Yeah, we could jump in.
Oh, sorry. So I have a question. So the character with white beard and like a gown, the guy was, well, the main character was coming out of the woods and you saw him dancing. Who was the character?
So Mexico is full of like all these traditions that mix like, you know, indigenous rights and wisdom with like Spanish, you know, influences. And so if you look at him, he's like, it's like, what is he? Is he a Spaniard? But he's dressed like he has like an Aztec, you know, crown. But his outfit is very similar to the conquistador. It was just wild, and we found that along the way in one of the key regions that was very involved in the conquest. They first resisted the Spanish, and then they allied themselves. Right, and so there's all these subtexts to the film. And even if you're Mexican, the film I think can still be surprising because very few people have traveled through that region in like this specific lens of like, what is the legacy of colonialism here, right? And so we invited those dancers. It was a group of dancers, but there's only one in the film, to appear and to kind of confront him with this mirror where it's like, you don't really know. And there's parts of Mexico that feel like that. It's like, where are we? Like, where's, you know, there's like a legacy that lingers and that is kept alive. You know, that dancer was part of the group, you know, and I think we all understand that being here in this space, right? Like, how important it is for people to continue their cultural practice and to innovate and all that. And like, these were all kids, like, that were doing this dancing. You know, they were like 18-year-old kids. Like, you know, we were like, can you please show up at like 6 in the morning and do this? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Question? Yeah.
Yeah, for the Conqueror's narrative, that was some fiction or some sort of recovered letters from that guy?
Yeah, I wrote them based on a lot of research. So he's giving you information that is, it's, you know, he's trying to tell a story. And it's very similar to the way the story was told by some of these conquistadores, and they obviously minimized or justified a lot of things, right? So he's telling you the story, but he's also very biased. He's not, you know, you can't trust him. but that's the big legacy that Mexico has, is a lot of books and letters left behind by different conquistadores, so I could inspire myself in that. But I also wanted you to get a feel for what happened in the past in those places. A little bit. There's a lot, right? But like when he enters Mexico City, he's like, where's the lake? This is so beautiful. And like, even today, like there's conversations around like, how do we bring back some of the lake to Mexico City? How do we reset the ecology of this place? Yeah.
It seems like you used a lot of natural light, and could you talk about some of the challenges or successes with filming, and what kind of crew you had, what a typical day of filming was like?
Yeah, I'm sorry to stress my baby.
It's okay.
I think he's just like really hungry. Is it? Could you go over here to the? Do you mind if?
Okay.
Yeah.
We have some space on the
You can
side.
just go over here, love.
Yeah.
And so the whole film is shot on natural available light. You know, whatever you see on screen, or like the sun, and we worked really hard on that. And I was lucky to have a really great cinematographer collaborating with me. And he had a very strong commitment to the story, and he said to me, I really, you have to let me bring like these things that I want to try to this project. You have to let me do natural light, and you have to let me use these like more like harder to use lenses, like the anamorphic wide look. It's really hard to use that, and but it worked out because it slowed everything down, and it also gave the film a sense of like it was almost like a painting, you know, a lot of natural light, you know. So if you start thinking of like classic painting, it starts to look a lot like that, and so it ended up all really coming together because that was the world that he was in, you know, like it just somehow felt like in between modern times and ancient times, and very proud of the work that the cinematographer did, and it was recognized in a couple of festivals like Tribeca, and there's this big festival in Poland where all the cinematographers go and, you know, like they nerd out, you know, over cinematography, and the film won a recognition there. And I think because like the idea and the content, you know, like behind the photography, they were really like bonded, you know. It wasn't like, sometimes we see films that are so visually striking, but it's at odds with the story. And then when it clicks, it just really does, and it makes the film stronger.
You think he ever was redeemed? I mean, obviously he was guilt. He felt guilt for this whole thing. He came back to this religious thing, and then maybe I missed it. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. So, you think he was redeemed in some way?
Well, there's a gentleman in that pilgrimage that tells him to get up because he still has a long way to go.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Right, and so it was really interesting because that gentleman, he was a real pilgrim. I was approaching people and talking to people, and he, I was like telling him the story. I was like, you know, this guy, he's gone through so much. He's come back from 500 years, and he's seen like, hey, like the effects of what I did have ballooned, right, and led to a lot of different things that are just blowing his mind, and he's here to ask for forgiveness. And then the man was like, I'm here to do the same thing. I'm here to ask for forgiveness too, and I'm not going to get it, but I need to come, and I need to do this. I've walked all night to be here. You see, so like there's something about the gesture that is important, and I think also I like to do the thought experiment of what would happen if we were taken 500 years into the future. What are those generations going to think about us? You know, we're dealing with a lot of major challenges and threats to the species. You know,
So you're saying it's an unanswered
it's unanswerable. Yeah, I don't know.
thing. In his case, it was unanswered. That's the way he wanted it.
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure to really sink him into the ground, and I didn't want to do that either because I feel like if you pretend like context doesn't matter and like the mindset doesn't matter, then you can't change that either. right? And like he's going through a process where everything he knows is breaking down, you know, like everything that he took for granted, you know, like God was on his side and all these things, you know, so there is some compassion for him. That doesn't excuse the violence, I think, right? But for instance, in Mexico, when this film was out, the president picked a fight with Spain, and he was like, Spain needs to apologize. And then he kept linking violence in Mexico to Spain, but it's like, you know, Mexico's been independent for 200 years. Like, we need to also be, you know, held accountable for repeating and reinventing those forms of violence, right?
Well, I mean, the question is whether the viewer lets him get redemption or not. I'm not feeling it yet. You know, I'm like, not, I have to put myself there, but I just can't.
I think he does learn humility, though. You know,
Sorry?
he learns humility, a little bit of humility. You know, he learns that, and so he remains human. He's not just a monster, and I think we need to see him that way too, because otherwise it's actually not accurate to history, right? Like there's human beings behind all these horror stories. That doesn't mean they're heroes either. So I don't know, but when I was filming the piece, nobody ever, none of the characters, none of the people on the street ever attacked or confronted the conquistador. Everybody wanted a dialogue. And the people, the victims who share their story, they wanted that dialogue most of all. Because what their point was is like, and I deliberately picked people who haven't been heard, right? Who have been telling their story for a while but haven't like gotten the change they wanted for like years, you know? And so they understood what it was like to be forgotten. And then I would link that to history, and we would have a conversation, and they would, you know, then start connecting themselves to this idea. But they all wanted dialogue. They didn't want punishment. They wanted dialogue first. And I think that's very telling, right? That victims take that position, and that these people who have suffered so much entered into this film and collaborated with us, you know. We didn't catch them or anything. It was they knew we were sometimes filming for days with them, you know.
I would imagine too, they would look at you more as an artist and not a journalist, or an investigative journalist, you know, especially with the conquistador wearing a costume. They could probably tell you were doing something more artistic.
Yeah, you don't want to, like in our, you don't want to mix that line. You don't want to be thought of as an investigator talking about these stories. Super dangerous. It's really dangerous, and so we were super clear, this is an art piece, and that resonated with them because it also opened up a new audience. We're talking about their stories here today. It's not in the news for a second. It's like, we're in San Francisco talking about them, right? And they're still, almost all of them, fighting for you know, to continue finding some justice in their story.
How have Spanish audiences reacted to the film?
Funny enough, no festival in Spain would play it.
Oh,
I'm like, guys, you're too sensitive. Like, what's going on here? We submitted to a very famous festival in Spain, and I know from rumors that there was a huge argument about the film. And they felt very offended. They felt it was
wow.
misery porn,
Wow.
and that somehow I had manipulated these people. And I'm like, well, it's your loss. And the funny thing is that year, a candidate in Spain came out dressed up like a conquistador, like a right-wing candidate.
Wow.
Wow.
So I'm like,
This is what is going on.
Seriously.
yeah. And so they have a huge problem with the right wing, like many countries in Europe. And but for me, you know, my commitment was to the people, and so as long as that is healthy, then that's fine. You know, a film can be seen in many different ways, but you have to keep that commitment. I'm still in touch with some of the people, actually, you know, except for like the soldier, you know, and the migrants you can't stay in touch with because of safety, for their safety. And but everyone else, I still, you know, every once in a while we message. I'm collaborating with the mom at the end of the film in my next film. You know, we're gonna do a portrait of just her, and like another mom. And so it grows, right? It's a process, and that's the part that's important to me. You know, one day I'm sure I'll be able to go to Spain and like show it somewhere and like really confront them.
What was it in your life that made you want to make a film like this?
My dad was a historian, and he really always was asking these open-ended questions about history, and he would take me to museums and treat me super seriously like I was a little kid, and he would walk me to, you know, through all these exhibits and just like create the sense of like history is a construction, right? I learned that when I was like 6 years old. You know, so you have to like always question what's the story that you're being told and why, right? And it stuck with me. And then this anniversary was coming up, and he was not a fan of me being a filmmaker. But in the process of making this film, he got more involved, and he started to really support the work. And I remember he was in the hospital, and the costume designer sent us like a deck of ideas, and he and I were going over them, and we picked the costume for the Conquistador, like the concept together, you know. And so it really spurred me that he was like planting these seeds and asking these big questions. Mexico's a country obsessed with its own history, like many, right? But in Mexico, there's so much energy and investment going into our history and who we're supposed to be, and everybody wants to take over that piece. And I think we can relate, because in the U.S., it's like, it's a constant debate. Behind everything is history. Oh, we're not really like that. We're like this. Or no, we're like that. And it's like the control of history is just so important to power, right? So I wanted to confront that with this film. And I also just love, you know, the idea of making a film when you're traveling, right, to all these places. So it was really fun. I mean, the research going into it, like the years of research before the film, so that you could show up in a place and be like, okay, this is the mountain that they climb. So the character has to be there, but also this is what happened in the past, and this is what's happening today. You know, and I really enjoyed connecting those dots and trying to make a film with so many rules. Because it's not like we were like, oh, okay, let's drive, you know, to a completely different region. Everything was shot in the places and then in sequence. So I really enjoyed that part of it as well. Like, it was almost like a cinematic research trip. Yeah.
Can you talk more about the impact of systems of power on individuals and kind of moving forward, what your thoughts are on that?
Well, I think if we were like a poor Spanish noble in the 16th century, we would be like, yeah, let's go to the New World. Let's make some money. Maybe I can like not be starving, right? Because a lot of nobles were starving. And they didn't care about who and what they destroyed on their way. You know, they were offered this context, right? And I think that's a system, right? And he never encountered anything outside of that system. He never lost that positionality. And I think, you know, the curse that the movie imposes on him is like, hey, you're going to have to listen to those who don't have the...
But you couldn't go there.
To where?
You didn't go before this. You didn't go...
Oh, I didn't go to Spain. No, yeah. It's just hinted in his voiceover, right? Like, oh, we're like, when he's with the migrants, he's like, oh, they're just like us. Like, we were just coming here to dream for something, right?
You're biting off a lot.
Yeah.
You're not going that far. Yeah. But that's great. A good section. So,
yeah, but that's the thing about the systems, is what I'm saying. He's in his own, he has to be reprogrammed, right? And these people, one by one, are like knocking them down, right? And he makes excuses, and he resists, and he gets like pulled and sinking and sinking and sinking. And I just thought it was just so fascinating to say, well, I'm just gonna make him have to confront this because I can, because it's a movie and you can just make it happen. Yeah.
And then he winds up working in the restaurant in the kitchen.
He winds up in Chinatown in New York, working, and you know, in the land of immigrants, right? And historically, you know, you think about the U.S. and how the U.S. came up in the history of empires, right? It's really interesting. I don't think I don't know what he's actually thinking in that scene, because we don't know how much time has passed between that pilgrimage and his washing the dishes, and that ending came from a place of trying to keep the question open, right? Like, we didn't want definition for him, because you want to keep thinking about it. But there's nobody who can give you answers about colonialism, I think. Like, in an art piece, it should be like a question, right? There's so many layers to it that are interesting. And for me, for instance, now that I'm collaborating with that mom, I think a lot about, like, well, how am I going to dig into her portrait and build it in a way that isn't the same as this film, right? And she herself has asked me, she's like, I have become tired of just talking about the terrible things that happen. I wish somebody would give me space to just talk about the great things that my daughter did. And that's what we're going to try to do. So we're in agreement, right? Like, she kind of went through this stage, and now we're going to move to another stage, right? And so that's the other way I see it too. It's like you try different things with different projects, and you move on. Yeah.
How do you balance, like, as a filmmaker, when you're letting people talk about trauma, they're talking about these really intimate things in their lives or that happen to loved ones in their family. How do you balance, like, being an artist but not being so much like a psychologist or a therapist?
Well, I think the big thing is research for me. If you show up with someone who's, like, has a disappeared loved one or to an indigenous community and you don't understand their context, that's not respectful. That's not cool. Like, that person expects you to really know. And even if you think you're prepared, you're still not prepared. There's so many specifics to how these things happen. And so you have to have an intention when you show up, and I try to share that with people. I do say, hey, this film isn't going to change the situation. That's like one of the first things I make clear. It's like, this isn't going to make the governor tell you where your son is, right? Because that's part of the problem for that character, is that the government disappeared those police officers. So, like, they're never going to tell you. And this film can't make that happen. So just setting the boundaries and the guardrails, and then saying, well, what do you want to talk about? She's the one who came up with the idea of bringing out the gun and the uniform. That's her. That's her contribution and collaboration with the process. So there's a lot of that, and I think the research element is what keeps you grounded and able to support them, and so that they don't feel like they have to educate you about everything, and you understand their context, and you understand, like, who their friends are, and a little bit about where they're coming from, and then you start sharing your process. I also had a very limited, there was only like 3 people I think on the set that could talk to people the first day that we were with them, because otherwise it's overwhelming, and it's very easy for someone to say something really disrespectful or insensitive. And so it was me, the actor, and the cinematographer. And that's it. Like, that's like the only people who could talk to the people. And we would build out, because I had talked to them over the phone, but it was different. Once they saw the actor, they were like, what is this? And I'm like, it's the thing we talked about, 6 months ago, and last week, but there was this constant resetting of the relationship, and just creating clear expectations, so that people understand, hey, this isn't like that interview you did for TV, this is going to take time, and we're going to need you to commit to that if you want to be in the mood.
Yeah, it was about that young girl's story. That was they just killed it without seeing anything, or like she maybe witnessed something.
There's a lot of speculation, but it's also very common. It's very, very common for lots of reasons that young women and girls are killed. And so that's, I've stayed in touch with her mom, and she is now doing a protest where she wants to carry 3,000 silhouettes representing victims to the presidential palace. So we're helping her with that. We helped her fundraise for that. And even in that process, I'm realizing like how difficult it is, because she has been attacked for that. She's been attacked for inviting people to this protest, you know, with all sorts of crazy excuses that don't make sense to anyone outside of that tiny world of activism. And you realize that it's not just normalized by the killers, it's normalized by all of society to be violent to certain people, right? And this sense of like, why are you complaining? Like, just move on, you know? It's really uncomfortable to keep hearing these stories. And Mexico is losing, you know, 10 women and girls a day to these crimes. And, you know, 95% of them are unpunished, you know? Many people don't even report them. And she did, right? And because of that, she lost her home. She can't live in her hometown. There's all sorts of things that happen to them. And yet she's still fighting, right? And so that's all not in the film, you know? And I guess just to talk about process is, when we did the interview with her, she said, I'm not giving you 5-10 minute summaries. I'm not doing that. I'm going to talk as long as I want and I need to speak, and I expect you to, you know, bring your art to that. And of course she wasn't expecting a 3-hour movie. That's how long the interview was. She went into every detail. But what she wanted was to be respected and to not be treated as a product, right? And so that's what I think is cool about filmmaking. It's like, we can do that. We can create our own rules, and we could say, yeah, I'll sit with you. You know, in this shoot that we're doing in November, we're bringing a therapist, and we're bringing her medicine woman that she works with, and like, there's like 20 people on the crew, right? But it's all based on needs that people have expressed.
Was that the hardest part about getting something going as far as a movie went? So like, you have this actor, and that's a kind of median for your existential process here. You've got an actor who's doing this. Otherwise, it would seem to me it would be awkward and hard to get it done. So, I mean, were there other awkward spots that you had to?
It was awkward at sometimes, but then people would understand. He's just the embodiment of power. So we're documenting power. You know, like he's there in the background. We just happen to illustrate power. So people understood that. I think the hardest thing was to listen to the stories and to know that you're walking away, you're going to make a film, it's going to be seen, and that problem is going to continue. That part is really hard. And it's hard when you follow up with people and they're like, this is still happening. This is still happening. The person who lost his father, who was a journalist, he just got a court ruling against him. You know, like, Lorena keeps fighting her case, and she has some good news and some tough news. And so that part is hard, because you have to go in already kind of pre-processing that a little bit, because you can't show up to somebody's house or you know, hear the story of Fatima, of this little girl, and then you break down because you're hearing this. Well, she's counting on you to do your job and to elevate the story, right? And so you have to do a lot of thinking and talking through it ahead of time, so that you're at least a little ready to hear it, you know? Because the last thing I want is for her to like have to, you know, get up and give me a hug, you know? Like, that's not, I don't think that's the best way to operate, right? I want her to feel that I have her back, and so I have to come up with other ways to process that.
But you did tell her the story was this.
Oh yeah, they all knew. They all knew.
just understood that was there.
Yeah, they all knew the Conquistador was there. They just don't share, her and the Conquistador don't share screen together. You know, because that's like the last character. There's lots of, it just works for him not to be there. But she saw him, she met him. He was in the room during every interview. So that built a lot of trust, you know. But
So
before,
he was a real guy
yeah,
when it came to, besides.
yeah, he would hang out and then he would sit through every interview, but then he was also in the pre-interview, the very long pre-process of building and getting to know people and seeing their house and blocking out the scenes. He was there the whole time. And he was, sometimes he would talk more, sometimes he would talk less to people, depending on how the relationship was. We would feel it out. Like with the soldier, the actor was, like somehow he clicked with the soldier hitman guy really well. And so he got that really crazy performance where the guy's like, oh, look at the guns and look at this. Like, he elicited that from him. And then, so that was actually what we filmed first. And then the guy kind of dropped his guard and started like talking about the deeper stuff, about how he felt like he had these big questions of whether he was doing the right thing or not, you know. So the actor was like always like observing and finding the moment where he needed to jump in or not, or touch or not, you know, just like, just this, a lot of emotional work for him. And then he had to turn into this guy, you know, which, you know, so I'm also very proud of him for the work that he did.
A few more questions. With your success as a filmmaker, with this film and other projects, have you ever been approached by Hollywood or been tempted or, you know, to make a Marvel sequel or something, you know,
Please don't.
multi-million dollar budget?
Oh, I'd love to make a Superman movie. I have a, you know, Superman is like the most powerful immigrant in Marvel Universe. You know,
That's right.
an immigrant has to make that movie, right? No, I mean, I think it's hard. I think it's really hard because then you start having conversations, and then sometimes people are like, they're not really looking for your ideas. They're just looking for other things, right? And so I found it hard, but slowly over time, you start to connect with more people and people who have seen the work. 499 is a film that a lot of cinephiles really love, and so that has opened up a lot of conversations. But at the end of the day, I'm interested in just like kind of doing the stories that I love. And so if those click, they click, right? Yeah, and I'm just like, I don't want the films to feel repetitive, and I don't want to say, okay, this is how I do films, and like, let me pick a story that fits or whatever. Like every story is a challenge, you know, and I like that. I have a film actually right now that's on PBS that you guys could watch as well if you're interested. It's about my friend who's incarcerated, and it was made after this one, and he wasn't allowed to be interviewed, so that created a really unique challenge. I can't interview him. How does he tell his life? So then we eventually asked his family to be actors in the reenactments of his memories. So like I like that. I like the like finding a solution to something that you became passionate about, and then you're like, okay, well, how do I do this? You know, I like that layer of like discovering something and really, you know, working to that connection with that person and making it unique. Yeah.
Can you talk? Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering what the name of that film was.
Oh, it's called Sansón and Me, Sansón and Me, and it's on Independent Lens. So if you go on your app, on the Independent Lens, it's like the first film in the new season. Yeah.
Say it again, the name?
Sansón and Me.
Have you spelled
Like the Bible?
Oh,
Yeah, S-A-N-S-O-N, and Me, and it's on
Oh,
PBS. Yeah, it's on the PBS Passport app if you have that at home, and you could just like stream it. I think they have it there for like almost 3 more weeks. Yeah.
Did you want to share any other news or anything else coming up that you'd like to say?
I think, you know, for me, it's just wonderful to be here. I was talking to Clara about this center and just wanting to come back and see some performances and just really engage with the community. For me, my wife was half Chinese, and there's some kids in her family, and we tried to, like, we became like their surrogate, like uncles and stuff, and like we've always just tried to just create like these connections to the Chinese American community. And so for me, it was very special to come and screen here and to have this kind of very expansive discussion in this really special setting. It makes me also think about like the history of this city and this state and all the violence that has been imposed, and has been forgotten, right? And now when you bring it up, it's like somehow a problem. And I think that's what the conquistador represents to me. It's like he's that thing that hasn't been resolved, right? He hasn't been addressed. And it's not to say that it's only his fault, but it's like there's something in the system, right? Speaking of systems, that we need to resolve. And it keeps coming up in our societies. It comes up all the time. The Bay Area has all these problems that are contemporary but also rooted if you start to listen to communities. So
Oh, you mean the elephant is standing right in the middle of the country right now?
yes, exactly.
Thank you so much for being
Thank
here
you.
today. We'll hopefully have you back again. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
And the shows, like the dancing shows,